The candles in Ashworth Hall had burned for 6 hours without interruption, and the wax had pooled so extravagantly across the silver holders that the footman had given up trying to manage it and simply let the excess harden where it fell. 300 guests filled the ballroom in an arrangement that was less dancing than display. The daughters of earls positioned near the columns, the sons of viscounts orbiting the punch table with studied negligence, and every surface that could be decorated having been decorated, draped, gilded, or hung with late autumn greenery, cut from the estate's own grounds and forced into something resembling spring. The Ashworth Autumn Ball was the largest gathering in the county, and it knew it, and it wanted everyone else to know it too. And at the edge of all that deliberate magnificence, seated at the writing desk in the anteroom that connected the ballroom to the service corridor, was Clara Ashby. She was not a guest, she was not quite staff. She occupied the position that the English country house had perfected over 2 centuries. The unmarried female relation who performed the work of a house steward while being addressed as a poor cousin and compensated with room, meals, and the understanding that gratitude was its own currency. Clara was 26 years old, and she had been managing the Ashworth estate accounts for 4 years under precisely those terms. Tonight, she was checking the seating arrangement against the dinner plan for tomorrow's luncheon, because the head housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, had informed her at 5:30 that 6 additional guests had arrived uninvited from London, and the original arrangements were now inadequate. And did Miss Ashby think she might sort it before morning? Clara had said she would sort it before midnight. She had a list. She always had a list. She was still wearing the gray wool dress she had worn to breakfast, because there had been no opportunity to change, and because she owned 2 presentable gowns and had worn the better one last week, and had not yet had it pressed. The gray dress was clean and plain and perfectly acceptable for the anteroom of a ballroom in which 300 people were wearing silk. She did not look up when the noise from the ballroom swelled and then suddenly compressed. The particular acoustic shift of a crowd turning toward a 8 doorway all at once. She knew what it meant. She had felt it once before, 4 years ago, the night the old Duke had made his last formal appearance before his health declined, and the room had done exactly this. Contracted, oriented, reassembled itself around a point of arrival. She turned a page. The Duke of Ashworth had come. She knew this because Mrs. Poole appeared in the anteroom doorway. 14 seconds later, her face set in the specific expression of a woman managing extreme concern with professional competence. "He's arrived," Mrs. Poole said quietly. "I see the room noticed," Clara said, without looking up. "The solicitor is with him, and a man I don't recognize, well-dressed. Not a social visit, I shouldn't think." Clara made a small mark on her list. "Is there anything that requires my attention tonight?" "Not yet." "Then I'll finish this first." Mrs. Poole nodded and withdrew. Clara added the 6 London guests to the luncheon arrangement in the only logical configuration available, shifted 2 of Lord Fenton's party to the east table, and wrote a note to the kitchen about the additional covers. Then she picked up the list and walked back through the service corridor to the housekeeper's room, and as she passed the small rectangular window that overlooked the far corner of the ballroom, she caught her first glimpse of the new Duke of Ashworth in 4 years. He was taller than she remembered, darker coated. He stood with the stillness of someone who had decided long ago that rooms like this one did not require his full presence, only a portion of it, deployed in careful measure. He wore no decorations, no orders on his lapel. His cravat was immaculate. Around him, the room arranged and rearranged itself like iron filings near a lodestone, and he seemed wholly uninterested in the effect. He was looking, with a particular measured attention, at the doorway through which Clara had just passed. She did not know that. She had already gone back to her list. The person being overlooked in any room, the anteroom, the service corridor, the writing desk, at the edge of everything, is very often the person keeping the room standing. Clara Ashby had been keeping Ashworth Hall standing for 4 years, and the new Duke had been in residence for less than an hour. It remained to be seen which of them would require the more urgent education. Clara had come to Ashworth Hall in the autumn of 1811, the same season her father died. Her father, Thomas Ashby, had been a solicitor in moderate practice in Bath, a man of genuine competence, and no particular financial costs, which meant that the competence had produced a comfortable life, and the lack of caution had ensured there was very little of it remaining when he was gone. He left Clara £112, a set of law books she had read entirely by the time she was 14, and a letter to his cousin Gerald Ashworth, the then estate manager at Ashworth Hall, recommending his daughter's intelligence and asking if there was any position available to a young woman of good education and reliable character. Gerald Ashworth had replied promptly. There was a position as a companion to his wife, who suffered from migraines and required someone to read to her and manage her correspondence. The wage was not mentioned. Clara had been 22 years old, and she had packed everything she owned into one trunk, and she had taken the coach north. She had learned in her first month that Gerald Ashworth's wife did not have migraines. She had nerves, which was a different thing, and what she actually required was for someone to manage the household correspondence. While she lay down in the afternoons, Clara managed the correspondence. Then Gerald noticed in the second month that Clara had a natural facility with numbers, and he began leaving the estate accounts on the desk in the morning room with a note asking if she might check the quarterly figures before he reviewed them. She checked them. In the third month, she found an error of £38 in the wool merchant's invoice that Gerald had been paying without question for 2 years, and she wrote directly to the merchant asking for a correction and received a check by return post, and Gerald Ashworth looked at her for the first time, with the expression of someone who had underestimated a tool and was revising his assessment. By the end of the first year, Clara was managing the estate accounts entirely. Gerald never said so formally. There was no contract, no wage adjustment, no acknowledgement in writing or in conversation that the estate accounts had passed from him to her. They simply had. She received the quarterly reports from the tenants and the wool merchants and the timber contractors and the grain agents, and she processed them, and she produced the summary ledgers, and she left them on Gerald's desk, and Gerald signed them. His name appeared on every document. Hers appeared on none. She had managed, in 4 years of that arrangement, to recover £4,300 in errors, unpaid debts, and renegotiated supplier agreements. She knew the figure precisely. She had calculated it herself on a Thursday morning in February because she wanted to know exactly what she had done with the years she had been given, even if Gerald never asked. The accounting work had not been the difficulty. The difficulty had been 1813, 18 months into her tenure, when the Ashworth Estates' primary wool contract had come up for renegotiation, and the merchant, a man named Hargrove from Sheffield, had arrived with a new agreement that was structured in a way that moved the price risk entirely onto the estate for 3 years, while protecting Hargrove's margins regardless of market fluctuation. Gerald had been prepared to sign it. Clara had read it in 40 minutes and written a 7-point annotation in the margin, specific clauses with the projected financial impact of each, and a counter-proposal for 2 of them. Gerald had looked at her annotation, the way men often looked at things that surprised them, and that they did not quite want to admit had surprised them. Then he had taken the document back to Hargrove and come home 3 hours later with a revised agreement that incorporated both of Clara's counter-proposals at a saving the estate would realize over 12 months of approximately £400. He did not tell Hargrove, who had drafted the counter-proposals. He did not tell anyone. Clara had picked up her list and gone back to the morning room accounts. She had not broken. She had understood, clearly and without sentimentality, that she was not going to be offered credit for the work she was doing. Not by Gerald, not by anyone in Gerald's circle, and that she had 2 choices. She could reduce what she offered to match what was acknowledged, or she could continue doing the work fully and understand that the record of it existed in the accounts themselves, in the figures, in the 4 years of ledgers, in which every recovered pound was documented with a date and a reason. The work was the record. She was not going to become less than she was, because Gerald Ashworth declined to see her clearly. She had kept the annotated copy of the Hargrove renegotiation. She kept it in the bottom drawer of the writing desk, beneath the account ledgers, with the date written in the upper corner, and the 7 points still visible in her own hand. It was not resignation that kept her at the writing desk. It was the specific decision, made once and held to every morning thereafter, that she intended to survive, and that surviving in her particular circumstances meant doing the work better than anyone could ignore, even if they found ways to ignore it anyway. She had managed accounts, creditors, tenant disputes, supplier fraud, and a collapsed drainage contract in the North Pasture. She could manage this. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. What she had not accounted for was that someone had been paying attention. Edmund Cavendish, 5th Duke of Ashworth, had inherited the title in June of 1815 when his father died of a long illness that had been consuming him for 3 years. He had spent those 3 years managing the family's secondary estates in the north and attending, as minimally as courtesy required, to the social obligations of a man in his position. He was 31 years old. He had been described in the county correspondence as cold, private, and exacting. He had also been described as eligible, which was the description that seemed to arrive most frequently and with the least relevance to anything he actually valued. His mother had died when he was 9 years old. He had not mentioned this to anyone in 22 years. He was not in the habit of mentioning things that still moved in him. He had received the estate management reports from Gerald Ashworth quarterly, as was standard, and, for the first 2 years, he had signed them without excessive scrutiny. In the 3rd year, the spring of 1814, he had noticed something. The reports for the Ashworth estate were different from the reports he received from his other properties. They were more precise. The figures were annotated with specific source references. Errors were flagged, not buried. The wool contract renegotiation summary included a breakdown of the clause-by-clause revision that saved the estate over the first 12 months, and the language of that breakdown was not Gerald Ashworth's language. Edmund knew Gerald's language from 4 years of quarterly correspondence. Gerald wrote, in the approximate manner of a man comfortable with general conclusions. Whoever had written the annotation to the wool contract wrote in the manner of a person who found general conclusions professionally insufficient. Edmund had sent his solicitor, a steady man named Mr. Harlow, to Ashworth Hall in April of 1814 with instructions to review the accounting records for the previous 3 years and to establish who was producing them. Mr. Harlow had returned with a report that was 2 pages long. The first page summarized the financial position of the Ashworth estate, which was considerably more solid than the other Cavendish properties Edmund managed. The second page contained one paragraph. The estate accounts are produced and maintained by Miss Clara Ashby, a relation of the estate manager by marriage, who has been resident at Ashworth Hall since autumn 1811. She receives no wage and holds no formal position. She is not acknowledged in the accounts. Mr. Gerald Ashworth presents her work as his own. The recovered sum over the period reviewed is approximately £3,900. Edmund had read the report twice. Then he had gone to his study window and stood there for some time. He had not made an immediate decision. He had made a decision the way he made all decisions, thoroughly, and without announcement, and at the point where he was certain he understood what he was doing. What he did was engage Mr. Harlow to continue monitoring the Ashworth reports quarterly and to note any further items of the same quality. Over the next 14 months, 3 more arrived. The Hargrove contract counterproposal, a documented correction of a timber contractor's invoicing irregularity, a written analysis of the North Pasture drainage collapse that identified the original contracting error and itemized the recovery path. He had kept all of them in the week before his father's funeral, while he was managing the succession of a dukedom and the legal machinery that accompanied it. Edmund Cavendish had taken the 4 reports out of his correspondence folder and read them again, in order, from 1811 to 1815. Then he had placed them in the inner pocket of his traveling coat and made arrangements to visit Ashworth Hall. He had arrived on the night of the autumn ball. Not by accident. He wanted to see how the house managed itself in the presence of 300 people and the pressure of a formal event. What he had actually seen, in the moment he arrived, was the doorway to the anteroom, and through it, the desk, and at the desk, a woman in a gray dress writing, with the focused attention of someone completing a task that needed to be done before she could do the next one. He had not seen her face. He had only seen the posture, upright, unhurried, thoroughly absorbed, and the list beside her hand. He had found himself looking at that doorway for longer than he'd looked at anything else in the room. His solicitor, Mr. Harlow, had appeared at his elbow and said quietly, "She's been there since the guests began arriving, Your Grace. Mrs. Poole says she's reworking the luncheon arrangement for the extra London party." "Tonight?" Edmund said. "She said she'd have it done before midnight," Mr. Harlow said. Edmund had returned his attention to the ballroom and said nothing further. He was not the kind of man whose face narrated his thinking, and what he was thinking was not yet ready to be said aloud. He had come to Ashworth Hall to make a decision about the estate's future management. He had found, in a gray dress at a writing desk, a reason to be more deliberate about that decision than he had anticipated. Clara met him formally the next morning in the library, because Gerald had summoned her. Gerald summoned her the way he always did when the estate required someone with competence and he needed to occupy the room with authority. He arrived first and arranged himself behind the large desk and sent the footman to ask if Miss Ashby might come at her convenience, which meant immediately. She came at her convenience, which was 15 minutes later, because she had been in the middle of reconciling the October flower account, and she did not want to lose her place. The Duke of Ashworth was standing at the window when she entered. He turned. His coat was dark, his bearing precise, his expression neutral, in the way that indicated he was actively deciding something rather than idling. Gerald was behind the desk, managing a kind of performed confidence that Clara had learned to read as anxiety. "Miss Ashby," Gerald said. His Grace wished to speak with some familiar with the estate accounts. I see, Clara said. She looked at the Duke. He looked at her with the same measuring attention she had registered through the window the previous night, except that now she could see it directly, and it was not the attention of a man surveying a room. It was the attention of a man examining something specific. You manage the estate accounts, he said. It was not a question. I assist Mr. Ashworth with the estate accounts, she said. She said it the way she always said it, in front of Gerald, which was the only version of the truth that Gerald would countenance. 29 of the 37 quarterly summaries produced in the past 4 years, the Duke said, are written in the same hand. The other 8 are written in a different hand. The 29 share a consistent analytical structure that the 8 do not. Mr. Harlow tells me the analytical structure matches your letter of inquiry to the Hargrove wool merchant in January of 1813. Gerald went very still behind the desk. Clara did not move. She stood where she was, her list in her hand, and said, "Yes, Your Grace, that is accurate." "Then you manage the estate accounts," he said again, without emphasis, without recrimination, without any implication that anyone in the room should feel uncomfortable, though at least one person clearly did. "I do," she said. He looked at her for another moment with that particular measuring attention. "I would like to discuss the North Pasture Drainage Report from March," he said. "The remediation path you proposed relied on a reallocation of the 1814 maintenance budget. Was that reallocation made?" "It was not," Clara said. Mr. Ashworth determined a different allocation was preferable. She said this without tone. It was simply a fact, and the Duke appeared to receive it as one. "I see," he said. She told him, over the next 40 minutes, exactly what had been implemented and what had not, and why, and the projected cost of the delayed drainage remediation would be over the following 2 seasons if it continued to be unaddressed. She told him without performance, without qualification, without apology. She told him the way she told herself things when she was at the writing desk alone, directly and completely, and with the specific numbers attached. When she finished, the Duke looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the window. Edmund said, "I'll want to see the full ledgers this afternoon, and I would appreciate it, Mr. Ashworth, if Miss Ashby accompanied you." He looked back at Clara. "If that is convenient." "It is convenient," she said. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. But she picked up her list and returned to the morning room with the specific sensation that something had shifted. Quietly and irreversibly, like a stone dropped into still water. What happened with the contract happened on the 4th day of the Duke's visit, and it happened in the library, and it was the worst 4 minutes of the previous 4 years. Gerald had drafted what he called a formal estate management agreement, which he presented to Clara the morning of the 4th day, with the air of a man doing something generous. The document was 1 page. It proposed to formalize her position as Gerald's administrative assistant at a wage of £18 annually, substantially below what a qualified estate steward would earn in a junior capacity for the same work, and it included a clause requiring her to submit all correspondence for Gerald's review before sending. She read it standing in the doorway of the morning room and did not let her expression change. She was still holding it when the Duke of Ashworth came through the library door that connected to the service corridor, which she had not known he was in the habit of using, and found her at the threshold with a document in her hand. He looked at the document. He looked at her face. He took 3 steps across the room, took the paper from her hand, and, before she could speak, tore it directly down the center. Then he placed the 2 halves on the table. "I have not read it," he said, "because I do not need to. Gerald Ashworth does not have the authority to formalize any arrangement on this estate. That authority transferred to me in June." He looked at her with the direct attention that she had, by now, come to recognize as his ordinary mode. "I apologize for this and for the 4 years that produced it." Clara looked at the two halves of the document on the table. She pressed one hand briefly against the writing desk's edge. Then she said, "I have something I would like you to see." She went to the bottom drawer of the writing desk, the one she had kept locked since her first year at Ashworth Hall, and she took out the folder she had maintained there. 4 years of annotated documents, carbon copies, margin notes, counter proposals, and corrected figures. Every piece of work she had done that Gerald had claimed. She had been keeping the record because the record was the only thing that was unambiguously hers. She set the folder on the table beside the torn contract. She did not narrate it for him. She simply opened it to the Hargrove annotation and stepped back and let him read. He read for 12 minutes. He stood at the table without sitting, without moving, without speaking, and he read with the same focused completeness he brought to everything. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at her. "This is 4 years of documented work," he said. "Yes," she said, "for which you were never compensated or credited." No. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of calculation, but the quiet of a man who was feeling something he had decided to feel completely before he responded to it. "I would like," he said, "to offer you a formal position as estate steward for the Ashworth properties, with a proper wage, a proper contract, drafted by Mr. Harlow, with your review before any signature, and with your name on the documents." Clara looked at him. "I will think about it," she said. He was not offended. He nodded as though she had said something entirely reasonable, which she had. She was not going to step aside for anyone, and she was equally not going to step forward without being certain of where she was stepping. She had not survived 4 years of invisible labor by making hasty decisions. The social machinery of Ashworth Hall had opinions about Clara Ashby's new position before the ink was dry on the contract. Miss Adelaide Forrest was the first person to make them formal. She arrived at Ashworth Hall 9 days into the Duke's residence, accompanied by her mother, Lady Forrest, and the collective understanding of the county's drawing rooms that she was the natural choice for the Duchess of Ashworth. She was beautiful, her breeding was impeccable, her estate in Surrey was well managed and profitable, and she had been told, in the careful language of well-meaning friends, that the Duke's regard was as good as assured. She believed this, and it gave her a particular confidence that expressed itself, when confronted with Clara Ashby, as gracious contempt. "Miss Ashby," Adelaide said, on the morning of her second day, finding Clara in the morning room with the October ledgers. "I understood you were the estate manager's assistant." "I am the estate steward," Clara said, without looking up from the ledger. "Ah," Adelaide said. There was a precision to that syllable that communicated everything Adelaide intended to communicate. How industrious. Clara turned a page. She found the figure she had been looking for. A discrepancy of £11 in the October milk receipts from the home farm, and made a small mark beside it. "It is a pleasant morning," she said, to indicate that she wished Adelaide well, and also that the conversation was concluded. Adelaide withdrew. She told her mother, who told Lady Grenville, who told 3 other women at the luncheon table that afternoon, that Miss Ashby had been given a position that was entirely inappropriate to her station, and that the Duke had clearly not understood what he was doing. Lady Grenville remarked that it was a pity, when men of good family had been so long in the north, that they forgot how these things were managed. The table agreed, with the polished murmur of a room that had made its decision and was simply performing it now. Clara heard about this from Miss Harriet Vale, who was staying at Ashworth Hall as a guest of Mrs. Poole's acquaintance and who had the directness of a person who considered social pretension a waste of everyone's time. Harriet was 28, compact, sharp-eyed, and constitutionally indignant on behalf of people being treated foolishly. She had introduced herself to Clara on the second day by appearing in the morning room doorway and saying, "Mrs. Poole says you're the one actually running this place. I thought you should know someone sees that." Then she had sat down and asked about the drainage problem in the north pasture, because she had an uncle with a similar issue in Devon. Clara had liked her immediately and been suspicious of that liking for approximately 3 days before concluding it was justified. "Adelaide Forrest is telling people you've been given a position inappropriate to your station," Harriet reported, pulling a chair to the other side of the morning room table. "Lady Grenville's version adds that you may have manipulated the Duke somehow, which I assume means you accidentally looked competent in his presence, and that reads as scheming to anyone who's never tried it." "I see," Clara said. "What are you going to do?" "Reconcile the October milk receipts," Clara said. "There's an £11 discrepancy with the home farm. I want it corrected before I present the quarterly summary." Harriet looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has just discovered they are in the presence of a very specific kind of person. "Right," she said. "Do you need help?" Mr. Harlow had warned Clara, on the day he had brought the draft contract for her review, that the institutional opposition was not going to be quiet. There were 3 investors in the Ashworth Estate Improvement Scheme, a canal project that Gerald had initiated and that Clara had identified as undercapitalized, and all 3 of them had dealings with Gerald, and none of them had been formally informed that the management of the estate had changed. 2 of them, a Mr. Calder and a Lord Pemberton, had written to Gerald asking for meetings. Gerald had written back without informing Clara or the Duke and had invited them to Ashworth Hall. They arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Clara had arranged to present the quarterly accounts to the Duke. They arrived in the same hour, which she suspected was not a coincidence. She was in the library with the Duke and Mr. Harlow when the footman came to say that Mr. Calder and Lord Pemberton had arrived and were asking for the estate manager. Mr. Harlow's expression did not change. Clara's did not change either, which was an effort, because she had reviewed the canal scheme investment contracts the previous week and had found something. "Bring them in," the Duke said. The 2 men who entered were the kind of men who entered rooms with the assumption that the room would orient toward them, which it did, because rooms generally do orient toward men with money and impatience. Mr. Calder was stout and certain. Lord Pemberton was taller and more careful. Both of them looked at Clara with the identical expression of a person who has arrived expecting someone else. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said, after a beat of recalibration, "we understood Gerald Ashworth was managing the estate business." "Mr. Ashworth is no longer in that position," the Duke said. "Miss Ashby is the estate steward. She was, in fact, the working steward for the 4 years of Gerald's tenure, which you may or may not have known." Calder's eyes moved to Clara. "The investment accounts for the canal scheme," he said, in a tone that was almost a question, "and mostly not, have been submitted by Gerald Ashworth under his signature." "They were produced by me," Clara said. She kept her voice at the register of a statement of fact. "The accounts you've received are accurate. However, I should tell you that the scheme's investment structure contains a problem." There was a pause. Not the pause of men who were startled, but the pause of men deciding how to receive unwelcome information from a source they were inclined to dismiss. "What problem?" Lord Pemberton said. Clara set the canal scheme investment file on the table. She had annotated it in red ink on 6 pages. The central issue was this: Gerald, over the course of the scheme's first funding round, had submitted 2 separate invoices for the same surveying work, once to the investor pool and once to the estate, and had received payment from both. The total was £94. Whether this was fraud or administrative error was not something Clara had stated in the annotation. She had simply documented it with dates, invoice numbers, and the 2 corresponding payment records, and let the sequence speak. She walked Calder and Pemberton through the 6 pages in 25 minutes. She did not characterize Gerald. She did not argue. She presented the sequence of documented transactions and answered questions about the figures with the precision of someone who had been living inside those figures for 4 years. When she finished, Calder was quiet for a long moment. Lord Pemberton looked at the Duke. "This is the work of your estate steward," he said, with a particular emphasis on the final word that was not quite disbelief and not quite respect, and was moving slowly and clearly toward the ladder. "It is," the Duke said. "If the duplicate invoicing is confirmed," Mr. Harlow said, from the corner where he had been quiet for the entire presentation, "the estate has a claim against Gerald Ashworth for the recovered amount plus legal costs." Calder set down the annotated page he had been holding. "Miss Ashby," he said. He said her name the way men say names when they are realigning information in their heads and do not want to perform the realignment too, obviously. "How long have you been managing these accounts?" 4 years, Clara said. "Since autumn 1811. Under Gerald Ashworth's signature." "Yes." He looked at Lord Pemberton. Lord Pemberton looked at the annotated file. Neither of them said anything for a moment that was long enough to contain a genuine reconsideration. "We will need to review the full canal documentation," Lord Pemberton said finally, not to Gerald, not to the Duke, but to Clara directly. "Of course," she said. "I'll have copies prepared." The private moments came quietly and without announcement, the way necessary things sometimes do. The evening after the investor meeting, Clara was in the music room at the west end of the house, which she had discovered in her first week at Ashworth Hall, and returned to regularly when the evening work was done. The room had not been used formally for some years. The instrument was a square pianoforte, a little old-fashioned, but excellently maintained, and the music on the stand was a handwritten score in a script that was not Clara's. She had found it on her first visit and had assumed it belonged to the previous Duchess. She had played it anyway, because the music was beautiful and the room was empty, and there was no one to tell her not to. She was in the middle of the second movement when she became aware, with the instinct that comes from spending years listening for sounds in large houses, that she was not alone. She did not stop playing. She finished the phrase, and then the next, and then she let the piece reach its natural pause and said, without turning, "How long have you been there?" "The opening measures," the Duke said. He came into the room the rest of the way. He stood near the doorway, not approaching, not retreating. "That is my mother's composition. She wrote it herself. I have not heard anyone play it since I was 9 years old." Clara turned on the bench. He was looking at the score on the stand with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was to say an expression that had something in it that was not contained and deliberate, but simply present. "I found it on the stand," she said. "I should have asked." "No," he said. He looked at her. "I am glad you play it. I had forgotten what it sounded like." He did not say anything else. He did not sit down, did not ask her to continue, did not make the moment larger than it was. He simply stood there for another minute in the quiet of the room, and then he said good night and went. Clara sat at the piano for a time after he had gone, her hands in her lap, feeling the particular weight of something she did not have a precise word for, and then she went back to her room. The next morning he arrived in the morning room at 8:30. He had never come to the morning room before, and placed the morning newspaper on the edge of the desk and said, "Your cravat is, that is to say, you do not wear a cravat, but your collar is folded in rather badly at the left side." He said this with perfect composure, which was not quite what she had expected. "It has been like that since breakfast," she said, straightening it. "I was aware." Something moved in him that might, in another man, have been amusement. "I also wanted to say that the North Pasture drainage remediation, the one Gerald declined to implement, I have authorized the budget. Mr. Harlow will begin the contractor engagement this week. The proposal you wrote in March is the one we are using." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He was already at the door. He paused. "Your floor plan rearrangement for the luncheon on the night I arrived," he said. "It was perfectly done. I looked at the original arrangement afterward. Yours was better." Then he went. She had managed creditors and contractors and wool merchants. She had managed 4 years of invisible labor. She had managed Gerald Ashworth's architectural confidence in his own importance, and Adelaide Forrest, as polished contempt and an investor meeting in which two men had reassembled their assumptions in real time. She was not going to be undone by a duke who reviewed her luncheon arrangement and said it was better. She was not. She picked up her list and went back to the October milk receipts. He came to the garden on the Thursday of the second week, which she had not expected because the weather was poor. A thin, gray rain that did not commit to being a storm but made outdoor conversation inadvisable. She was there because she had needed to physically inspect the path from the estate's walled garden to the home farm. As part of her assessment of the drainage proposal's surface water implications, and she had her boots on, and had already walked the path and was making notes in her notebook when he came around the garden wall with his coat buttoned against the weather. "The drainage assessment doesn't require your personal presence in the rain," he said. "It does, actually," she said, "because the survey map from 1809 shows the path 3 feet further west than it actually is, and the difference matters for the water table analysis." He looked at the path. He looked at her notebook. He said nothing for a moment, and then he moved to stand beside her and look at the same section of path she was looking at, and they stood there in the thin gray rain, not quite side by side, while she explained the discrepancy between the 1809 map and the current physical reality. And he listened, in the way he listened to everything, which was completely. Then he took off his coat and held it over her notebook to keep the rain off the pages while she finished the note. She looked at the coat over her notebook. She looked at him, in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, standing in the Ashworth rain as though it were an entirely sensible location for a duke. "That is your coat," she said. "I am aware," he said. She was not going to become sentimental about a man holding a coat over her notebook in a garden. She finished the note. She closed the notebook. She said, "I believe the path deviation is sufficient to affect the original drainage proposal's surface water model. I'll revise it this afternoon." "All right," he said, and put his coat back on. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like kindness, but she walked back to the house with the specific feeling of someone who has been, for the first time in a long time, genuinely looked after, and she pressed the notebook against her chest for a moment as she went through the garden gate and did not examine the feeling too closely. Harriet Vale found her that evening in the housekeeper's room, where Clara was copying the revised drainage calculation into the estate record. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, had placed a pot of tea on the table without comment, which was her form of support, and had gone back to her evening accounts. Mrs. Poole had been the first person at Ashworth Hall to offer Clara a genuine welcome. 4 years ago, she had knocked on Clara's door on the first night, handed her a candle and a key to the linen room, and said, "The house is bigger than it looks. You'll want a key." No warmth performed, no warmth withheld, simply practical and specific and real. He held his coat over your notebook, Harriet, sitting down opposite Clara with the air of someone reporting something of great consequence. "It was raining," Clara said. "In a walled garden on an estate he owns. He could have been anywhere." Harriet reached for the teapot. "Clara, the man held his coat over your notebook in the rain." "I noted it," Clara said, and turned a page. Harriet looked at her with the expression of someone who has found a person simultaneously infuriating and entirely admirable. "You know," she said, "the rest of us are not this controlled." "I find it useful," Clara said. The formal opposition arrived on the 15th day of the Duke's residence at Ashworth Hall, and it arrived in the form of the Duke's father's oldest friend and the most senior trustee of the Ashworth Family Estate Trust, Lord Alderton. He was 71 years old, formidably built, and in possession of a title that predated the Ashworth dukedom by 40 years, which meant that when he came to Ashworth Hall, with the express purpose of expressing his concern about the Duke's management decisions, he came with the authority of a man who had known Edmund Cavendish since he was in short coats, and considered this knowledge a form of standing. He arrived with a letter from Adelaide Forrest's father, and the collective worry of 3 aristocratic families who had expectations. He did not come unkindly. He came with the genuine belief that what he was doing was correct. "She is not of suitable birth," Lord Alderton said, in the library where Edmund received him. "She has no family connections of any relevance. She was, until a fortnight ago, performing the work of an estate assistant under the name of another man. I do not raise this against her personally. I raise it as a structural matter." "I understand," Edmund said. "The investment in Adelaide Forrest's candidacy, socially speaking, the expectation, is not inconsiderable." He paused. "Nor is the value of the Forrest connection." "It is not," Edmund agreed. Lord Alderton looked at him with the expression of a man who has expected more resistance. "Then you understand why I've come." "I understand why you've come," Edmund said. "I also understand, Lord Alderton, that the estate you've described as well managed and financially secure was managed into that condition by a woman you are now describing as unsuitably positioned. I have 4 years of documented accounts that show the work. I have an annotated wool contract, a north pasture drainage analysis, and an investor fraud identification that none of the estate's male personnel produced or detected. The structural question about birth and connection is a real one, and I do not dismiss it, but I am asking you to consider whether the structure is correctly describing what it is seeing." Lord Alderton was quiet. "I am not asking you to approve," Edmund said. "I am asking you to be accurate." The older man looked at the floor. Then he looked at Edmund. Something moved in his face that was not agreement, but was the particular expression of a man confronting a fact he had not expected to have to confront. "She produced the canal scheme fraud identification," he said, as though confirming a thing he already knew. "In 6 annotated pages," Edmund said. Lord Alderton stood. He gathered his hat. He said at the door, "I cannot say I approve, but I will not oppose what I cannot honestly call wrong." He went. Edmund stood at the library window for a long time after he left. It was not the outcome he had wanted, and it was the most he had expected to get. And he was not the kind of man to be surprised by the difference. The formal investor hearing for the canal scheme was called by Lord Pemberton for the 21st of November in the assembly room of the county courthouse, because the duplicate invoice documentation had been passed to a legal advisor, and the legal advisor had confirmed that a formal accounting was required before the scheme could proceed to its second funding round. All parties with investment or management interest were requested to attend. Clara arrived with her folder. The assembly room was a high-ceilinged, cold-floored space built for public business, and it was full. Pemberton and Calder were seated at the long table. Mr. Harlow was present. 3 members of the county legal establishment occupied a row of chairs at the side. Adelaide Forrest's father, Sir Edward Forrest, was in the gallery with Lord Alderton and 4 other men whose families had various stakes in the scheme, or in the question of what happened to it. Harriet Vale was sitting in the second row of the gallery, with her arms folded and an expression that could only be described as ready. Gerald Ashworth was present, because he had been required to be, and he was sitting in the corner nearest the door. The Duke of Ashworth was at the right side of the room, standing, which Clara had noted, because she had also noted that he could have sat and had chosen not to. She went to the table. She had 6 pages of annotated documentation, the original invoice files from the estate accounts, and the payment records from the investor pool. She had organized them in the order in which they told the clearest story, which was the only order she considered valid. She did not bring notes for a speech. She did not bring an advocate. She had the documents, and the documents were what they were. Mr. Pemberton, who was chairing the hearing, said, "Miss Ashby, you have submitted documentation regarding the canal scheme accounts. We have questions about the basis of that documentation, given that the accounts were managed under Mr. Gerald Ashworth's name until very recently. The accounts were produced by me throughout the period in question," Clara said. "I have the working copies with my annotations, dated, which are distinct from the fair copies submitted under Mr. Ashworth's signature. The content is identical. The handwriting is not." She placed the working copies and the fair copies side by side on the table. "The handwriting question is simple to resolve. I am happy to write any passage requested so that you can compare it yourself." Someone in the gallery was quiet in a specific way that communicated surprise being converted, in real time, into attention. She presented the duplicate invoice documentation in the order she had prepared it. Invoice number 1. Dated April of 1814, submitted to the estate accounts, payment recorded. Invoice number 2, dated May of 1814, submitted to the investor pool, for identical surveying work, payment recorded. The total, £94, paid twice for one piece of work. She placed both invoices on the table, original documents, and said nothing beyond what the documents required. "The question of whether this constitutes fraud or administrative error is not mine to determine," she said. "The documentation shows what occurred. The determination is for this room." Calder looked at the invoices for a long time. He looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the door. "Miss Ashby," Lord Pemberton said, and his voice had changed. It had moved from the register of a chairman managing a difficult situation to the register of a man making an honest assessment, which are not always the same register. "The accounts you've maintained, the full estate accounts, not just the canal scheme, are they in the same order?" "Yes," she said. 4 years of full estate accounts, all working copies held and dated. The estate's current financial position, solvency, margin, outstanding debts, is documented at every quarter. I can produce any figure for any period in the 4 years. "The recovered margin," Calder said slowly. "The £4,300, Mr. Harlow's review identified. That is documented. To the penny," she said. The room did not erupt. The room had the particular suspension of a space that has received new information too consequential to respond to quickly, and it held that suspension for a moment that was longer and heavier than comfortable. Lord Alderton, in the gallery, was looking at Clara with an expression she had not seen him wear before, which was the expression of a man who has been imprecise in his judgment and is aware of it. Adelaide Forrett's father's was looking at his hands. Gerald was no longer near the door. Then Lord Pemberton said, "The investor pool accepts the documentation as presented and requests a full review of the canal scheme accounts under Miss Ashby's direct management going forward, assuming Miss Ashby is willing to continue in that capacity." He had started to say, "Her Grace," and had caught himself, and the correction had been heard by everyone in the room, and by no one more clearly than the Duke of Ashworth. Edmund walked to the table. He did not do it with drama, did not make an announcement of it. He simply walked across the floor of the assembly room and stood beside Clara's chair and looked at Lord Pemberton and said, "Miss Ashby is the estate steward of the Ashworth properties and will continue in that position under a formal contract. That contract has already been executed." He looked at the room, not the gallery, not the table, not Gerald Ashworth in the corner. He looked at the room, all of it. The way he had looked at Clara in the library, on the morning of the 4th day, with the measuring attention of someone who has made a decision, and is communicating, precisely and without drama, that the decision is made, and it is my intention, if she will have me, to offer her a rather more permanent position than estate steward. Clara looked at him. He did not go down on one knee in the assembly room. He extended his hand, bare, without a glove, which in 1815 in a formal room full of witnesses was its own form of statement, and he waited. She thought about it. She did so in the actual way she thought about things, which was completely, with the full weight of what she knew, and what she felt and what she intended applied to it. 3 seconds. She took his hand. The room changed. It did not erupt, because rooms with Lord Pemberton in them do not erupt. But there was a collective adjustment of posture and position and opinion, quiet and irreversible, that moved through the assembly, like a note played clearly after a prolonged and difficult chord. Lord Alderton, in the gallery, folded his hands in his lap. He did not speak, but the expression on his face was no longer the expression of a man in opposition. It was the expression of a man who had looked at something clearly, and was, privately and without announcement, revising what he had said it was. The private proposal came 3 days later in the morning room, which was, Clara had decided, the place she felt most fully herself in Ashworth Hall, and which he seemed to have understood without being told. He came in at 9:30, which was not his usual time, and he sat down in the chair opposite the writing desk, which he had never done before, and he looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has prepared something and is going to say it completely, not because the hearing made it convenient, he said, and not because the position requires it, and not because it is the next logical step in any arrangement I have made or need to make, but because you held 4 years of your own work in a drawer and kept it, and when you were handed something unjust, you produced the accurate record and let it speak. And I have never seen anything braver in a library in my life. And because you played my mother's composition, and you asked if you should have asked first, and I have thought about that question nearly every day since. I am asking you properly and privately because you deserve to be asked properly and privately, even if the room already knows the answer. Clara set down her pen. She thought about it. She thought about 4 years of accounts and £112 and a coach north, and the gift bottom drawer of the writing desk and the walled garden in the rain, and a coat held over her notebook, and a pianoforte with a handwritten score on the stand. She thought about the way he had listened to her, explain the path discrepancy in the drainage model, and the way he had torn the contract in two before she could speak, and the way he had extended his bare hand in the assembly room and waited. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything. He simply reached across the desk and placed his hand over hers for a moment, and then he went back to whatever he had been doing before he came. She sat for a while, with the pen in her hand and the October accounts unfinished on the desk, and the morning light coming through the window, and she thought that this was what it felt like, this precise, ordinary, quiet feeling, when you had not become less than you were, and the world had finally looked. They were married in the village church on the 14th of January, 1816, in a ceremony that was small by the standards of the Ashworth dukedom and large by the standards of anything Clara had ever been offered in her life. Harriet Vale stood with her, which was not a formal role but was entirely the correct one. Mr. Harlow, who was 63 years old and had been providing information at the right moment for longer than Clara had been alive, witnessed the register with the particular satisfaction of a man who has watched a thing go correctly. Mrs. Poole, who had given Clara a candle and a key on her first night at Ashworth Hall, wept briefly and practically, and then went back to the kitchen to confirm the wedding breakfast arrangements. Edmund's father's three-family coalition did not attend the wedding. Lord Alderton did at the back of the church, and left before the reception, and sent a note the following week that said only, "I was wrong in one or two particulars about what constitutes structural suitability. Congratulations." It was not warm, it was accurate, and for Lord Alderton that was the same thing. Adelaide Forrest was married by autumn to a baronet from Hampshire, whose estate was well run and who appeared to value her particular abilities appropriately. Clara, hearing this from Harriet in a letter, was genuinely pleased, which surprised her and then did not. The canal scheme completed its second funding round in the spring of 1816 on the basis of the revised financial projections Clara presented to the investor pool in February with her name on the documents. The North Pasture drainage remediation was completed in March at 11% under the projected cost, because Clara had revised the contractor agreement 3 weeks before work began and had negotiated a performance clause that Gerard Ashworth would never have thought to include. The estate's recovered annual margin, stabilized from the figures she had rebuilt over 4 years, was £620, 112% of the rate it had been returning when she arrived. She knew the figure precisely. She had calculated it herself. The neighboring estate at Keswick Hall wrote to the Ashworth estate in June asking for guidance on their supplier contract structure, having heard that the Ashworth wool and grain agreements had been substantially improved in the past year. Clara wrote back with a 12-page annotation framework, which she called a practical account review, and which Keswick adopted in full within 2 months. By the following spring, 3 other county estates had written requesting copies. She had not meant to build anything beyond what the work required, but the work had required it, and so she had, and the annotated framework became the thing she was known for, in a way that had nothing to do with whom she had married. Edmund was aware of all of this in the specific way he was aware of things, not because he had been told, but because he paid attention. He watched her with the same measuring attention with which he had first seen her, at the writing desk in the anteroom, in the gray dress, with the list, except that now the attention had a warmth in it that had not been there on the first night, and she knew it was there, and she felt it, the way you feel the particular warmth of a room that has been prepared for your arrival. Their daughter was born in October of 1816, 14 months after the ball, at which Clara had reworked the luncheon arrangement in the anteroom, while the rest of the county noticed the Duke had come. They named her Anne, which was Edmund's mother's name, and she arrived with a full complement of opinions and a temperament that was, according to Harriet, entirely her mother's, and also somewhat her father's, which was Harriet's way of saying she was simultaneously precise and quietly uncompromising. She had Edmund's stillness and Clara's facility with numbers, both of which became apparent by the time she was 3, when she memorized the household account categories and began offering unsolicited observations about the kitchen expenditure. Edmund watched Anne very carefully, with the specific attention of a man who found her unexpected and entirely legible, and who was learning, with the ongoing surprised gratitude of someone who had been isolated a long time, what it meant to have a house that was full. The morning room at Ashworth Hall remained Clara's room, in the sense that a room becomes a person's when they have worked in it long enough that the furniture remembers them. She kept her accounts there, and her review frameworks, and the folder from the bottom drawer of the original writing desk, which she had kept. Not from sentiment, she told herself, though that was not entirely accurate, because the record of the work was the work, and she did not believe in discarding things that were true. One morning in November of 1817, 2 years after the ball and the torn contract and the bare hand extended in the assembly room, Edmund came into the morning room at 9:30 and sat in the chair opposite the desk and watched her work. Anne was in the nursery down the corridor, conducting what sounded like an extremely thorough audit of her toy drawer. The fire was lit. The estate reports were current. Clara knew he was watching. She had known for some time. She finished the paragraph she was writing in the estate review, set the pen down, and looked up. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn in the walled garden, in the rain, and in the assembly room, before he extended his hand, this expression of a man who had made a very deliberate decision and found it, upon continued review, entirely correct. "The October figures," he said. "Better than September," she said. "I expected nothing less." From down the corridor came the sound of Anne escaping the nursery and running on the stone floor with the specific velocity of a small person who has discovered running and found it satisfactory. Clara picked up her pen. Edmund stood, already moving toward the door to intercept her. He caught her at the corridor threshold, and Anne, scooped up, regarded him with the grave attention of a child, assessing whether she had been stopped or retrieved. "The kitchen," Anne announced. "The morning room," Clara said, from the doorway. Anne considered this with the expression of someone weighing 2 options carefully, which Clara had been told was entirely familiar. Then she pointed at her father's coat lapel and said, "Crooked." It was, slightly. Edmund looked at Clara. Clara looked at the lapel. "It has been crooked since breakfast," she said. "I was going to mention it." He straightened it himself. Anne approved. And the morning at Ashworth Hall continued in exactly the way that mornings continue when the house is running well, and the figures are better than last month, and the person beside you has chosen you with the same deliberate, considered, unretractable certainty with which you chose them, and there is nowhere else either of you needs to be.